In 1979, John Osbourne seemed to have ceased to exist. Only Ozzy remained, the embodiment of addiction, clothed in an ill-fitting, oversized garment. His eyes, once fixed on packed stadiums, were now empty, devoid of light and soul, staring blankly at the ceiling of a West Hollywood hotel room. He was a ghost haunting his own life, an empty shell worn down by a decade of reckless living under the name Ozzy, now filled with a bottomless despair that no amount of vodka could ever drown. He had been erased from the band he himself had named, stripped of the only identity Ozzy had ever understood, and left to drift into inescapable oblivion. There are no plans for tomorrow because, in his chemically altered mind, John is dead. Only a walking tragedy remains, one who simply forgot to lie down and stop breathing. He awaits the final darkness to engulf him, unaware that the door is about to open and force Ozzy back into the painful light of life. The road to this purgatory began 3 decades earlier in a world devoid of color. John Osbourne was born on December 3rd, 1948, in Aston, Birmingham. It was a city recovering from the German Luftwaffe. The landscape was defined by bomb sites, smokestacks, and the relentless gray of industrial recovery. The Osbourne home at 14 Lodge Road was a small terraced house with 2 bedrooms. John shared this space with his parents and 5 siblings. There was no indoor toilet. The winter wind cut through the brickwork. Privacy was a luxury they could not afford. His father, Jack, worked nights at the GEC factory making toolmakers. His mother, Lillian, worked days at the Lucas factory assembling car circuits. They were cogs in the British industrial machine. John was a terrified child. He was afraid of the dark, the bullies, and the teachers at Prince Albert Road Junior School. The education system in the 1950s was brutal. John sat at his desk, staring at letters that refused to stay still. They danced and blurred. When he was asked to read aloud, he stammered. The teachers did not see a learning disability. They saw stupidity. They saw laziness. The diagnosis of dyslexia did not exist for a working-class boy in Aston. The remedy was physical punishment. Teachers struck him with rulers. He internalized their contempt. He developed a defense mechanism that would serve him for the rest of his life. He became the class clown. He learned that disrupting the class was better than failing in silence. He learned that chaos was a shield, but there was a darker shadow than the classroom. He was targeted by bullies, not just for violence, but for sexual humiliation. The trauma was buried deep, layered under jokes and later under gallons of alcohol. He learned early that the world was a predatory place. He left school at 15. The headmaster's parting words were a prediction of prison or the gutter. John walked out of the gates with no qualifications. He took a series of menial jobs, plumber's mate, car factory worker, before finding the job that would etch itself into his psyche, the slaughterhouse. His job was in the kill room. He was a stomach washer. He had to slice open the stomachs of sheep and cattle and empty the green, digesting grass. The smell was indescribable. It was the scent of hot death and manure. It clung to his skin. It seeped into his pores. No amount of scrubbing could remove it. He graduated to killing. He used a captive bolt pistol. He held the cold metal against the head of a cow, pulled the trigger, and watched the animal collapse. He slit throats. He did this hundreds of times a day. 200 sheep, 50 cows. It became a rhythm. Kill, bleed, gut, repeat. The violence became banal. He desensitized himself to gore. He stopped seeing animals and started seeing units of production. This exposure to mass death hardened him. It removed the natural revulsion to blood that most people possess. It laid the groundwork for the macabre theatrics he would later bring to the stage. When you have waded through sheep intestines for a wage, Biting the head off a bat is just another day at the office. Desperate for money, he decided to become a burglar. He was terrible at it. He wore gloves with the fingers cut out, leaving his prints on everything he touched. He was caught almost immediately. The judge sentenced him to 3 months in Winson Green Prison. Prison was a university of crime. To pass the time, he decided to give himself a tattoo. He took a sewing needle and some grate polish, graphite powder mixed with water. He sat on his bunk and pierced his own skin. Painfully, slowly, he tapped the needle into the knuckles of his left hand. O-Z-Z-Y. It was an act of defiance. He was branding himself like the cattle he used to slaughter. He was stating that he belonged to himself. In a flash of the absurdest humor that sat alongside the darkness, he also tattooed happy faces on his knees so they would smile at him when he sat on the toilet. He emerged from prison with a harder edge. The time inside Winson Green had not rehabilitated him. It had only taught him the brutal mathematics of survival. He walked out of the gates with a criminal record, a homemade tattoo across his knuckles, and a deep, simmering resentment for authority. The world he returned to was the same gray industrial struggle he had left behind. The sky was still choked with smoke from the factories. The streets were still lined with the debris of a war that had ended years ago, but refused to leave the architecture of Birmingham. He was a young man with no skills, no education, and a future that pointed directly toward a life of manual labor and quiet desperation. He took odd jobs to keep his mother from worrying. He tuned car horns on an assembly line. The noise was deafening, a constant mechanical scream that filled his head for 8 hours a day. It was mindless, soul-crushing work. He felt the weight of the factory pressing down on him, threatening to turn him into just another cog in the British industrial machine. Then the radio changed everything. He heard She Loves You by the Beatles. The sound cut through the gray static of Birmingham. It was a shock to his system. The melody was sharp, the energy was infectious, and the message was simple. It didn't sound like the dreary hymns of Sunday school or the clanking metal of the factory floor. It sounded like freedom. It sounded like color in a black and white world. John Osbourne looked at Paul McCartney and realized that you didn't have to kill sheep. You didn't have to tune car horns. You didn't have to accept the gray destiny the school system had laid out for you. You could make noise and people would love you for it. The realization was profound. It wasn't just about music, it was about escape. He saw a path out of the slums that didn't involve burglary or a punch clock. He needed tools. In the music scene of the late 1960s, talent was secondary to equipment. Everyone had a guitar, but nobody had a voice that could be heard over the drums. He approached his father, a man who worked himself to the bone, and asked for a loan. It was a massive request. The money required to buy a proper public address system was astronomical for a working-class family. But his father saw something in John's desperation, or perhaps he simply wanted to keep his son out of prison. He gave him the money. John bought a PA system, a massive investment. It was his golden ticket. He wasn't selling his voice, he was selling the volume. He placed an advertisement in a local shop window, written on a scrap of paper with the blunt simplicity of a ransom note. Ozzy Zig needs gig, has own PA. This caught the eye of Terrence Geezer Butler, Tony Iommi, and Bill Ward. They were not friends. They were rivals and neighbors in the tight-knit, competitive Birmingham circuit. Iommi and Ward had been in a band that broke up. Butler was looking for a new direction. They saw the ad and knocked on John's door. They didn't find a polished frontman. They found a skinhead with a manic look in his eyes, holding a chimney sweep's brush, surrounded by the smell of his family's small, crowded house. But he had the PA system. That was the leverage. They formed a band, initially calling themselves the Polka Tulk Blues Band, then Earth. They played the blues because that was what you did in England in 1968. You copied American blues musicians, played 12-bar shuffles, and hoped the pub crowd wouldn't throw bottles. They were competent, but they were invisible. They were just another loud band in a sea of loud bands. They slept in a transit van, freezing in the winter, eating scraps, driving hundreds of miles to play for people who didn't care. But something was shifting in the culture. The optimism of the 1960s was dying. The flower power movement, with its promises of peace and love, was rotting on the vine. The news was filled with images of the Vietnam War, student riots, and the Manson family murders. The world was not sunny, it was violent and chaotic. The music on the charts still sang about holding hands, but the reality on the streets of Birmingham was unemployment and decay. Tony Iommi noticed a cinema across the street showing a horror movie. It was likely a Boris Karloff film. The line of people waiting to get in wrapped around the block. They stood in the rain, clutching their tickets, eager to sit in the dark and be terrified. Iommi watched them and had an epiphany. Iommi made an observation that was more capitalist than artistic. It was strange that people paid money to be frightened. He looked at his bandmates and proposed a radical shift. Why were they singing about love when they lived in a world of fear? He suggested they stop playing blues and start playing scary music. They began to experiment. Iommi, whose fingers had been severed in a factory accident and capped with melted plastic, had to detune his guitar to relieve the tension on his injured hand. This physical limitation created a sonic innovation. The strings were loose, they flapped. When he hit a chord, it didn't chime, it growled. It was a low, menacing rumble that vibrated in the chest. Geezer Butler, obsessed with the occult and black magic, provided the thematic direction. He wrote lyrics about a dark figure standing at the end of his bed. They built the music around a specific musical interval. They played the devil's interval, the diabolus in musica. This was the tritone, a dissonant interval of 3 whole tones that the medieval church had supposedly banned because it invoked an unsettling, unstable feeling. It resolved to nothing. It created tension without release. They wrote a song called Black Sabbath. It was slow. It was heavy. It plodded like a giant beast walking through a swamp. It was the antithesis of the fast, upbeat rock and roll of the era. They changed their name to Black Sabbath. The reaction was immediate. When they played, the audience stopped talking. The girls stopped dancing. The clinking of beer glasses ceased. The room went cold. It wasn't fun. It was dreadful. And the crowd was mesmerized. They had tapped into a vein of anxiety that the hippies had ignored. The youth of the industrial Midlands saw themselves in this music. They didn't relate to songs about San Francisco and flowers. They related to the sound of metal stamping on metal. They related to the lyrics about war, paranoia, and corruption. Black Sabbath wasn't offering an escape. They were offering a reflection. They recorded their debut album in a single day, essentially playing their live set in a studio. It was raw, unpolished, and undeniable. It cost only £600 to produce. It was released on Friday the 13th, February 1970, a date that fit their ominous sound perfectly. Critics hated it. They called it primitive and ugly. But the record sold. They sold by the thousands. Money brought freedom, but it also brought access to drugs. For 4 working-class men who had grown up with nothing, the sudden influx of cash was disorienting. They moved to London. They bought cars they couldn't drive. And they discovered that if you had money, people would bring you anything you wanted. Ozzy took to the lifestyle with a fervor that frightened the others. He didn't have an off switch. While the others might stop after a night of partying, Ozzy kept going. He drank until he passed out, woke up, and drank again. He discovered cocaine, and it was as if a light had been turned on in a dark room. It made him feel powerful. It made him feel articulate. It silenced the insecurity that had plagued him since his school days. By the time they recorded Volume 4 in Los Angeles in 1972, they were importing cocaine in bulk. They rented a mansion in Bel Air. The drug use ceased to be recreational and became a necessary fuel for their existence. Logistics were established to ensure a steady supply. The budget for cocaine ballooned, eventually eclipsing the budget for the studio time itself. It was delivered in large containers, sometimes disguised as laundry detergent. Ozzy estimated he snorted enough white powder to fill a swimming pool. The days and nights blurred together. They lived in a chemical haze, recording during brief moments of lucidity and spending the rest of the time in a paranoid stupor. Ozzy was at the center of this cyclone. He was the one who pushed the boundaries further than anyone else. If there was a ledge, he walked it. If there was a bottle, he finished it. The anonymity of the addict became dangerous. In Atlanta, he vanished before a show. He was found hours later sleeping against a brick wall on a public sidewalk. Hundreds of people had walked past the homeless-looking drunk, unaware they were stepping over a rock god. But the dynamic in the band was toxic. Success did not bring equality. Tony Iommi was the undisputed leader. He wrote the riffs. He dictated the musical direction. He was the stern taskmaster who kept the machine moving. Ozzy was the mascot. He was the voice, yes, but he was also the court jester. He couldn't play an instrument. He couldn't read music. He relied on the others to translate the noises in his head into songs. This dependency bred insecurity, and that insecurity made him a target. Iommi bullied him. It was framed as camaraderie, as the rough housing of brothers, but it had a cruel edge. Iommi would set Ozzy's beard on fire or punch him. He would knock him out. Ozzy took it. He laughed along. He was the clown. That was his role. He believed that if he stopped making them laugh, if he stopped being the punchline, he would cease to be useful. He internalized the abuse, medicating the humiliation with more alcohol. He became a character, a caricature of himself, performing the role of the madman because it was the only way he knew how to fit in. Boredom bred madness. In one infamous incident, he stripped naked, covered himself in blood, and ran through a hotel hallway holding a piece of jagged glass like a shark fin. When police arrived expecting a killer, they found him curled up on the carpet, fast asleep. The years ground on. The tours became endless loops of airports, hotels, and arenas. The camaraderie began to splinter under the weight of exhaustion and addiction. Legal battles with former management drained their finances, adding stress to an already volatile situation. They were selling millions of records, but felt like they were running on a treadmill, chasing a payout that never quite arrived. Ozzy's coping mechanisms began to fail. The alcohol stopped making him happy and started making him angry. The cocaine stopped giving him energy and started giving him paranoia. By 1976, the death of his father hit Ozzy like a hammer. Jack Osbourne had been his anchor. He was the man who had given him the money for the PA system, the man who had believed in him when the school system had written him off. When Jack died, something inside Ozzy broke permanently. He disintegrated. He didn't have the tools to process grief. He didn't know how to mourn. He only knew how to numb. Haunted by mortality, he became obsessed with the death of free guitarist Paul Kossoff. Ozzy would hold seances in hotel rooms, sitting in the dark, talking to empty chairs, convinced he was communicating with the dead musician. He disappeared. He missed rehearsals. When he did show up, he was incoherent, a weeping, raging mess. The band, dealing with their own addictions and pressures, had little patience for his breakdown. They viewed his grief as a lack of professionalism. Ozzy felt abandoned. The rift between him and Iommi widened. He quit the band, then rejoined, but the spirit was gone. During his brief departure, the band hired singer Dave Walker. When Ozzy returned, he refused to sing Walker's lyrics, forcing Iommi to rewrite the entire album from scratch, fueling the resentment. He was a ghost haunting his own career. The domestic situation at his home, Belyden House, deteriorated into a war zone. His marriage to Thelma was collapsing. She was trying to raise children in a house occupied by a man who was rarely sober and often hallucinating. She tried everything to contain him. She tried screaming. She tried reasoning. When those failed, she tried logistics. She attempted to control him through his vanity and his modesty. One afternoon, she gathered every piece of clothing Ozzy owned, his jeans, his stage gear, his shirts, his underwear, and locked them away. She reasoned that he would not leave the house naked. She believed shame would keep him indoors and away from the pub. She miscalculated. The addiction was stronger than the shame. The thirst was stronger than the social contract. Ozzy woke up shaking. The withdrawal was a physical sickness, a gnawing need that overrode all other cognitive functions. He searched the house. He found it stripped bare. He did not go back to bed. He went to Thelma's closet. He found a floral dress. It was too small, the fabric straining against his frame, but it was coverage. He squeezed into it. He walked out the front door, marched through the conservative English village, a bearded, tattooed man in a woman's floral dress, and ordered a pint at the pub. He sat there, staring down the locals, who whispered and stared. He didn't care. He had his drink. This incident, known as the dress incident, proved there was no bottom. It proved that he would sacrifice his dignity, his marriage, and his reputation for the next drink. The madness escalated. The line between reality and hallucination vanished. During a binge fueled by cocaine and acid, his paranoia fixed on the animals in his estate. He stood at the window, staring at the chicken coop. In his chemically altered mind, the birds were not livestock. They were enemies. They were conspiring against him. They were mocking him. He grabbed his shotgun. He marched into the yard, shirtless and sweating, and opened fire on the coop. The noise was deafening. Feathers and blood exploded in the air. He reloaded and fired again until the movement ceased. But the destruction didn't satisfy the rage. He needed something bigger. He climbed into his Ferrari. He revved the engine. He drove the Italian sports car directly into the rebuilt structure. Metal crunched against wood. The car stalled in the wreckage. He climbed out, laughing manic laughter. He viewed the destruction of a supercar as a punchline. The band saw a man who was actively trying to kill himself. They watched him with a mixture of horror and exhaustion. They were all addicts, but Ozzy was different. He was reckless in a way that threatened their livelihood. He was no longer just the clown. He was a liability. The recording sessions for the album Never Say Die in 1978 were a disaster. They were recording in Toronto in the dead of winter. The studio was freezing. The atmosphere was poisonous. Ozzy refused to sing the songs Iommi wrote. He refused to write lyrics. He lay on the couch in the control room, wasted, reading magazines while the band waited. He was known as the studio vegetable. He was present physically, but mentally he had checked out. He was sabotaging the process, perhaps subconsciously begging them to put him out of his misery. The tour that followed was a death march. They were supported by a young, hungry band called Van Halen. Van Halen was energetic, happy, and tight. Black Sabbath was old, tired, and sloppy. Every night, Ozzy would go out and perform, but the spark was gone. He was going through the motions, a caricature of the Prince of Darkness. Backstage, the silence between him and the rest of the band was deafening. They traveled separately. They spoke only when necessary. The brotherhood that had been forged in the slums of Birmingham and the van rides across England was dead. It had been strangled by resentment and drugs. The decision was made in Los Angeles. Tony Iommi, the architect of the band, looked at the numbers and the quality of the performances. He saw a sinking ship. He knew that if they kept Ozzy, Black Sabbath would cease to exist. It was a business decision. It was a survival decision. But Iommi, despite his dominance, could not bring himself to deliver the final blow. He couldn't look his childhood friend in the eye and tell him it was over. He delegated the task. He told Bill Ward to do it. Bill Ward, the drummer, Ozzy's drinking partner, the man who was arguably as fragile as Ozzy, was given the gun. Ozzy was in his room at the Le Parc Hotel. He was expecting a call about rehearsals. He was expecting a call about the next tour. When the phone rang, he picked it up with the groggy reflex of a man who had been asleep for years. Bill's voice was shaking on the other end. He didn't drag it out. He didn't offer platitudes. He delivered the news with the blunt force of a captive bolt pistol. "You're out. It's over. We're moving on." The line went dead. Ozzy sat there holding the receiver. The silence of the hotel room rushed in to fill the space where his identity used to be. For 10 years, he had been the voice of Black Sabbath. He had been the face of heavy metal. Now, he was just John Osbourne again. He was the factory worker who had lost his job. He was the failure the teachers had predicted. He looked around the room at the pizza boxes, the empty bottles, the drawn curtains. He felt the weight of his own redundancy. He didn't feel anger in that moment. He felt a terrifying hollowness. He was 30 years old and he was finished. The firing in 1979 was the surgical removal of a gangrenous limb. When Bill Ward made the call to the Le Parc Hotel, he wasn't just firing a singer, he was saving the business. Chapter 3, The Blizzard and the Beast, 1980 to 1982. Back in the Le Parc Hotel, Sharon Arden ripped open the curtains. The sunlight hit the room like a physical blow, exposing the squalor that Ozzy Osbourne had been living in for 3 months. The suite was a disaster zone of piled pizza boxes, empty vodka bottles, and unwashed clothes. The air was thick with the smell of stale alcohol and neglect. Ozzy lay on the floor, a bearded, bloated wreck of a man who had accepted his fate as a casualty of rock and roll. He shielded his eyes from the glare, expecting eviction or perhaps a final lecture before being abandoned. Sharon did not offer pity. She offered an ultimatum. She looked at the mess on the floor and saw a wasted asset. She told him to get up. She made him a deal. She would manage him, but he had to work. There was no negotiation. The dynamic was established in that instant. Sharon took control of the logistics, the money, and the discipline, leaving Ozzy with only one responsibility, which was to sing. She dragged him out of the hotel and into the rehearsal studio. The industry had written him off. To the executives and the press, Ozzy was a burnt-out relic from the 1970s, a man who had been fired by his own band for being too intoxicated to function. Nobody wanted to work with him. They viewed him as a liability. Sharon ignored the rejection. She began auditing musicians in Los Angeles, looking for a spark that could reignite a dead career. The process was grueling. A parade of guitarists walked through the door, most of them trying to imitate the heavy, sludge-like sound of Tony Iommi. Ozzy sat on the couch, often drunk, unimpressed and uninspired. He was looking for a sound he couldn't describe, something that would differentiate him from his past. They found a guitarist named Randy Rhoads. He walked into the studio late one night, a small, slight figure who looked completely out of place in a heavy metal audition. He was not a leather-clad biker. He wore a polka dot bow tie and fitted trousers. He looked like a doll. He held a Gibson Les Paul that seemed too big for his frame. Randy was a teacher by trade, a classical musician who studied music theory and lived with his mother. He drank very little. He was quiet, polite, and disciplined. Ozzy, lying on the studio couch in a haze of alcohol, took one look at him and assumed it was a joke. He told Sharon to let the kid play just so he could go back to sleep. Randy plugged into a small practice amp. He didn't play a blues riff. He didn't play a Sabbath clone. He began to play scales. He played with a speed and precision that defied physics. The sound was clean, sharp, and melodic. It cut through Ozzy's stupor. It was the missing piece. The pairing was illogical, but the chemistry was explosive. They were opposites in every conceivable way. Ozzy was the chaotic ID, a man of pure instinct and raw emotion who couldn't read a note of music. Randy was the disciplined superego, a technician who constructed solos like an architect. When they wrote together, it wasn't a jam session. It was a collision of worlds. Randy took Ozzy's haunting, wailing melodies and built complex, neoclassical structures around them. He didn't try to be heavier than Black Sabbath. He tried to be smarter. He introduced texture and speed. Randy wrote riffs that were triumphant. They entered the studio to record what would become the album Blizzard of Oz. The atmosphere was charged with a desperate energy. They had a limited budget and a lot to prove. They recorded quickly. Tracks like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley were not labored over for months. They were captured with the urgency of a band that knew they were fighting for their lives. The result was a sound that defined the 1980s. It was heavy metal, but it was bright, sharp, and technically dazzling. Critics often overlooked his voice, focusing on the antics. But Ozzy possessed a unique, haunting, melodic sensibility. He could craft a hook that stuck in your head instantly, a talent he honed amidst the industrial noise of Birmingham to be heard over the machinery. It was the sound of Ozzy Osbourne reborn, not just as a doom-laden prophet, but as a high-energy madman with a voice that could command stadiums. Sharon knew the music was good, but she needed shock. The music industry in 1981 was crowded. To break through the noise, they needed more than just great guitar solos. They needed a spectacle. They needed to remind the world that Ozzy Osbourne was dangerous. They scheduled a meeting with CBS Records in Los Angeles. The executives at the label were skeptical. They saw the signing of Ozzy as a risk. They expected him to be difficult and unprofessional. Sharon instructed Ozzy to make a gesture of goodwill. The plan was simple and theatrical. He was to walk into the boardroom, make a charming speech about his new direction, and release 2 white doves into the air. It was meant to be a symbol of peace, a photo opportunity. Ozzy arrived drunk. The plan began to disintegrate the moment he walked into the building. He was wearing a long coat with deep pockets where the birds were hidden. He had been drinking all morning to calm his nerves, but the alcohol had only spiked his aggression. He walked into the conference room. The executives sat around a long mahogany table, suits and ties, looking at him with a mixture of boredom and disdain. They were checking their watches. They were waiting for the clown to perform. Ozzy felt the disrespect. He felt the judgment. He sat down, the birds fluttering in his pockets. He tried to speak, but the words were slurry. The tension in the room rose. He looked at the faces of the men who held his career in their hands, and he felt a surge of defiance. A dark impulse took over. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the first dove. The bird flapped its wings, confused by the sudden light. The room went quiet. The executives leaned in, expecting the stunt. Ozzy didn't throw the bird. He didn't let it fly. He brought the animal to his face. He opened his mouth. He bit its head off. The sound was a wet crunch that echoed in the silent room. He spat the severed head onto the polished table. Blood sprayed across the wood and onto the laps of the executives. The body of the bird twitched in his hand. The room erupted in chaos. Secretaries screamed. Grown men scrambled back from the table, knocking over chairs. Security was called. Ozzy, vibrating with adrenaline and alcohol, pulled out the second dove and did it again. He was thrown out of the building. Sharon was screaming, but she knew the value of what had just happened. The story hit the newswires within hours. Madman Ozzy bites head off dove hit the headlines. CBS doubled the promotional budget. They realized that they weren't selling a singer. They were selling a monster. The tour became a legend of excess. It was a traveling circus of debauchery. The band played to sold-out arenas, fueled by the notoriety of the dove incident. The concerts were chaotic. The audience, emboldened by Ozzy's reputation, began to participate in the madness. They stopped bringing flowers or lighters. They started bringing meat. It became a ritual. Fans would smuggle in raw steaks, liver, intestines, and dead animals to throw on stage. The stage crew had to shovel pounds of rotting meat off the floor after every show. It was grotesque, primal, and exactly what the brand required. Ozzy fed off the energy. He prowled the stage like a caged animal, dodging debris, screaming until his throat bled. Then came Des Moines, Iowa, on January 20th, 1982. The Veterans Memorial Auditorium was packed. The air was thick with smoke and noise. During the set, a teenager in the front row threw something heavy onto the stage. It landed with a thud near Ozzy's boots. In the glare of the spotlights and through the haze of his own intoxication, Ozzy looked down. It appeared to be a rubber bat, a toy, a Halloween prop. He wanted to look menacing. He wanted to give the crowd a show. He picked it up. He held it high. He opened his mouth and clamped his jaws down. It was not rubber. The bat was real. It had been smuggled into the venue, dead or stunned, by a fan named Mark Neal. As Ozzy's teeth sank into the neck, the animal woke up. He felt the wings flap against his cheeks. He felt the fur brush against his lips. He tasted the warm, salty fluid that flooded his mouth. It was blood. The realization hit him instantly. He recoiled. He spat the carcass onto the stage floor. The audience cheered, thinking it was another theatrical trick. They didn't know that the singer was standing there, gagging, realizing he had just bitten into a disease vector. The show finished, but the nightmare was just beginning. He was rushed to the hospital. The doctors were incredulous. He had to undergo a series of painful rabies shots, injected directly into his stomach muscle every day for weeks. The injections were agony. They used long needles that had to pierce the abdominal wall. Ozzy had to endure this torture while continuing the tour. He would play a show, scream for 2 hours, and then go backstage to be stabbed in the stomach. The bat incident sealed his reputation. He was no longer just a rock star. He was the Prince of Darkness. He was the boogeyman that parents warned their children about. Religious groups picketed his shows. They burned his records. They claimed he was a Satanist, a ghoul, a danger to society. Ironically, the famous devil horns hand gesture he popularized was not satanic at all. It was the Malakio, a sign his grandmother used to ward off the evil eye, but the media saw only the devil. Ozzy didn't deny it. He couldn't. The narrative had taken on a life of its own. However, the fun era of the solo career was hurtling toward a concrete wall. The behavior that had been dismissed as marketing was revealing itself as severe pathology. The drinking was not stopping. The drug use was escalating. Sharon was fighting a losing battle to keep him functional. She resorted to extreme measures to control him. In every city, she would scour the hotel room for alcohol. She would hire bodyguards to watch his door. And when all else failed, she would take his clothes. The Alamo incident occurred mere weeks before the end of the tour, when the band arrived in San Antonio, Texas. It was February 1982. The heat was oppressive. Ozzy was confined to his hotel room. He was bored, restless, and suffering from withdrawals. He managed to get drunk, though the method remains a mystery of addict ingenuity. He wanted to go out. He wanted to walk. But Sharon had executed her standard protocol. She had hidden every pair of pants, every shirt, and every pair of shoes he owned. She left him with nothing but her own clothes. To a rational man, this would be a deterrent. To Ozzy Osbourne, it was a wardrobe choice. Once again, Sharon had hidden his clothes to keep him in the hotel. Once again, he put on one of her dresses. It was a knee-length garment that looked ridiculous on his tattooed frame. He put on her running shoes. He stumbled out of the hotel room, evaded security, and walked out into the Texas afternoon. The sun was blinding. He was drunk at 2 p.m, staggering down the sidewalk, muttering to himself. The alcohol in his system demanded release. He needed a bathroom. There were none. He saw a wall. It was a high stone wall that looked like any other piece of masonry in the city. He didn't read the plaque. He didn't know the history. He just saw a place to urinate. He walked over to the wall. He lifted the dress. He relieved himself on the stone. He did not realize he was desecrating the sacred grounds of the Alamo cenotaph, the most sacred shrine of Texas liberty. This was the monument to the men who had died fighting for independence. To the people of Texas, it was holy ground. To Ozzy, it was a urinal. A police officer saw him. The officer did not see a rock legend. He saw a drunk man in a dress defiling a national monument. The arrest was immediate and rough. Ozzy was handcuffed midstream. He was dragged to the station, confused and belligerent. The fallout was nuclear. The city of San Antonio banned him for 10 years. He received death threats. People threatened to shoot him if he ever returned to Texas. It reinforced the narrative that he was anti-American and morally bankrupt. The tour continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The fun was gone. The chaos was becoming dangerous. The band was exhausted. They were traveling hundreds of miles a day, playing high-energy shows, and dealing with the constant drama of their singer. They were looking forward to the break. They were looking forward to going home. They had one last stretch to complete. They arrived in Leesburg, Florida, on the morning of March 19th, 1982. The bus pulled into a rest area known as Flying Baron Estates. It was a large property with a private airstrip and a house owned by the tour bus company. The bus needed repairs to the air conditioning unit. The driver, Andrew Aycock, parked the vehicle. Aycock was a man with a troubled history. He was a licensed pilot, but his license had expired. He had a history of erratic behavior. He had been driving the bus all night. He was wired on cocaine. The drug kept him awake, but it also made him reckless. He saw a small Beechcraft Bonanza F-35 parked on the airstrip. He decided to take it for a joyride without permission. He invited the band members to go up. Most refused. They were sleeping. They were tired. Don Airey, the keyboardist, went up for the first flight. Aycock flew erratically, buzzing the trees, showing off. They landed safely. Aycock wanted to go up again. He saw Randy Rhoads standing outside the bus. Randy was afraid of flying. He hated small planes. He was a cautious man who avoided unnecessary risks. But he was also a devoted son. He wanted to take some aerial photographs of the Florida countryside to send to his mother. He agreed to go up for a short flight just to take the pictures. Rachel Youngblood, the band's makeup artist and seamstress, also got on board. She had a heart condition and wanted a calm ride. Aycock promised to take it easy. They took off into the clear morning sky. Ozzy was asleep on the bus. Sharon was asleep. The rest of the band was passed out in their bunks. The bus was parked near the house. Inside the plane, The cocaine in Aycock's system began to dictate his actions. He wasn't satisfied with a scenic flight. He wanted to scare the people on the bus. He wanted to play a game. He banked the plane and dove toward the parked vehicle. He pulled up at the last second, the engine roaring over the roof. He circled around. He did it again. On the ground, Don Airy watched in horror, realizing the pilot was out of control. Aycock circled for a third pass. He came in too low. He misjudged the angle and the speed. The left wing of the Beechcraft clipped the top of the tour bus. The sound was the screech of tearing metal. The impact shredded the fiberglass roof of the bus right above where the band members were sleeping. The plane lost all aerodynamic stability. It did not crash into the ground immediately. It cartwheeled through the air. It snapped a large pine tree in half. The momentum carried the fuselage directly into the garage of the nearby mansion. The garage contained cars and fuel. The impact ignited the tanks instantly. The explosion was deafening. A fireball erupted, engulfing the garage and the plane in seconds. The heat was intense enough to melt metal. Inside the bus, the impact threw Ozzy from his bunk. He hit the floor, confused, thinking they had been in a highway accident. He scrambled to his feet. He heard the screams outside. He ran out of the bus door and into the grass. He saw the house. It was an inferno. The flames were roaring, consuming everything. He saw Don Airy on his knees, screaming. Ozzy tried to run toward the fire. He wanted to help. He thought maybe they could pull them out. But the heat drove him back. It was impossible. The fire was too hot. The destruction was too complete. There was no movement inside the garage. There were no sounds coming from the plane. The silence beneath the roar of the fire told him everything he needed to know. The bodies inside were burned beyond recognition. They would later have to be identified by dental records. Ozzy stood in the field, watching the smoke rise into the blue Florida sky. He was shaking. He was wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants, standing barefoot in the grass. The reality of what had happened crashed down on him. The kid who had saved his career was gone. The virtuoso who had given him a new musical life was dead. It wasn't a drug overdose. It wasn't a lifestyle casualty. It was a senseless, violent accident caused by a cocaine-fueled driver. Randy Rhoads was dead. He was 25. Ozzy's grief was instant and total. He had lost his musical soulmate. Chapter 4, The Monster, 1983 to 1989. The aftermath was a descent into a darker hell. The grief that consumed Ozzy Osbourne following the death of Randy Rhoads was not a sadness that could be processed through tears or therapy. It was a total systemic collapse. He was a man who had already been dangling over the edge of sanity, and the loss of his anchor sent him plummeting into the abyss. The tour did not stop. The machinery of the music industry demanded that the show continue, regardless of the carnage. They had dates to play. They had tickets sold. Ozzy was forced back onto the stage mere days after the crash, standing in the spotlight where his friend used to stand, listening to a stranger play the guitar parts that Randy had written. Sharon scrambled to keep the tour alive, hiring replacements like Bernie Torme and Brad Gillis. But to Ozzy, they were just ghosts standing in Randy's spot. It was a torture session disguised as entertainment. He broke down on stage night after night. He would turn to look at the guitar player, expecting to see the small blonde figure of Randy, and see someone else. The cognitive dissonance tore him apart. He shaved his head. It was not a fashion statement. It was an act of self-mutilation born from a frantic desire to escape his own skin. He walked into a room, grabbed a razor, and sheared off his hair until his scalp was raw. He wanted to change the person in the mirror because he could not stand to look at the survivor. He suffered from severe PTSD, though in 1982 the term was rarely applied to rock stars. He hallucinated. He spoke to empty chairs. He sat in hotel rooms for days with the curtains drawn, convinced that Randy was in the room with him. He asked the empty air why he had been the one to survive. He was the addict, the mess, the liability. Randy was the talent, the discipline, the future. The guilt was a physical weight that pressed down on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He medicated the grief with unprecedented amounts of alcohol. He stopped drinking to get high. He drank to reach a state of unconsciousness where the memory of the fire would stop playing on a loop in his mind. The years that followed were a blur of chemical dependency that transitioned from recreational use to biological necessity. By 1984, Ozzy Osbourne had become a functioning monstrosity. He was bloated, his skin was gray, and his eyes were perpetually hidden behind blue-tinted glasses because the capillaries had burst. He was touring for the album Bark at the Moon, but the man on stage was an automaton pilot by vodka. Musicians came and went like disposable lighters. Guitarist Jake E. Lee was fired via telegram. Then came Zakk Wylde, a young genetic clone of Randy Rhoads, who became Ozzy's son and drinking partner, fueling the chaos further. It was during this period that the rivalry with the new generation of metal bands began. Los Angeles had spawned a glam metal scene that prided itself on excess. Bands like Mötley Crüe viewed themselves as the new kings of chaos. They modeled their behavior on the stories they had heard about Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. They wanted to out-party the master. When Ozzy joined them on tour, they viewed it as a challenge. They wanted to see if the legends were true. The 1984 tour with Mötley Crüe stands as the nadir of rock excess. Mötley Crüe wanted to be the wildest band on earth, but Ozzy operated on a different level. The younger band members, Nikki Sixx and Tommy Lee, treated debauchery as a sport. They were young, athletic, and resilient. They drank for fun. They smashed hotel rooms for the adrenaline. Ozzy drank because his nervous system required ethanol to function. He smashed things because he was angry at the molecules of the air. The difference in their pathology became clear at a hotel stop in Lakeland, Florida. It was a sunny afternoon. The members of Mötley Crüe were lounging by the hotel pool, nursing hangovers and cocktails. The atmosphere was relaxed. Then Ozzy appeared. He was wearing a dress. This was a recurring theme in his life, a byproduct of Sharon's desperate attempts to keep him confined to his room by hiding his trousers. It had ceased to be a deterrent and had simply become his uniform. He walked out to the pool area, pale and shaking, the floral fabric stretching over his frame. He was agitated. He had run out of cocaine. He approached Nikki Sixx and asked for a line. Sixx didn't have any. Ozzy asked for a straw. Sixx handed him one, confused about what he intended to do with it since there was no powder on the table. Ozzy scanned the ground. He looked at the concrete pavement baking in the Florida sun. He saw a line of small black ants marching from a discarded popsicle stick toward the grass. He knelt down. He did not hesitate. He did not look around for approval. He placed the straw against the pavement, directly over the column of insects. With a sharp inhale, he snorted the entire line of live ants up his nose. The sound was audible. The ants were pulled into his nasal cavity, twitching and biting. He stood up, his eyes watering. The insects lodged in his sinuses. He didn't gag. He didn't laugh. He simply absorbed the sensation. The members of Mötley Crüe stared in silence. They had seen people do terrible things for shock value, but this was different. This was visceral and disgusting. But Ozzy wasn't finished. The lack of reaction from the ants seemed to bore him. He needed to escalate. He lifted the dress. He urinated on the pavement, the stream pooling on the hot concrete. Then, in a move that defied all logic and sanitation, he knelt back down. He lowered his face to the puddle. He licked it up. He stood up, his face wet with his own waste, and looked at the young rock stars. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The message was clear. They were tourists in the world of madness. He was a resident. He wasn't trying to be cool. He was showing them that his degradation was pathological. He was showing them that there was no line he wouldn't cross to feel something, anything, that could penetrate the numbness of his existence. The ants and the urine were not a prank. They were a symptom of a man who had completely severed his connection to social norms and hygiene. Mötley Crüe later admitted that moment changed them. They realized they could never win the game of excess against Ozzy Osbourne because Ozzy wasn't playing a game. He was dying in public. While his body fought toxins, his lawyers fought a battle that threatened to destroy him. The mid-1980s in America was a time of moral panic. The Parents Music Resource Center, led by Tipper Gore, had launched a crusade against rock music, labeling it as the primary corrupter of youth. Heavy metal was the main target. They looked for scapegoats, and in Ozzy Osbourne, they found the perfect villain. He was the madman. He was the bat-biter. He was the dress wearer. It was easy to paint him as a satanic figure leading children to their doom. This cultural war moved from the Senate floor to the courtroom in 1986. The parents of John McCollum, a 19-year-old from Indio, California, filed a civil suit against Ozzy and CBS Records. Their son had committed suicide in October 1984. He had shot himself in the head with a .22 caliber pistol while lying on his bed wearing headphones. The album spinning in his Walkman was Blizzard of Oz. The song that was playing at the end of the tape was Suicide Solution. The McCollum family argued that Ozzy Osbourne bore criminal responsibility for the death. They claimed that the lyrics of the song, combined with what they alleged were subliminal commands hidden in the frequency of the track, had bypassed the boy's conscious mind and hypnotized him into pulling the trigger. They argued that the music created a hemisync tone that made the listener vulnerable to suggestion. The allegations were specific and chilling. They claimed that under the fade-out of the song, Ozzy could be heard chanting, get the gun, shoot, shoot, shoot." The media frenzy was immediate. Religious groups surrounded the courthouse. They held prayer vigils. They burned effigies of Ozzy. The narrative was simple. This British rock star was a warlock who was using black magic and audio engineering to murder American children. Ozzy was summoned to court. He had to sit in a witness stand wearing a suit that felt unnatural and defend his art against accusations of murder. He was sober for the trial, terrified that a wrong word would send him to prison or bankrupt the entire music industry. If the plaintiffs won, it would set a precedent that an artist was liable for the actions of their fans. No one would be able to write a song about depression, war, or death ever again. The weight of the First Amendment rested on the shoulders of a man who had snorted ants 2 years prior. Ozzy had to explain in court that the song was actually about the alcohol-related death of his friend Bon Scott from AC/DC. He explained the wordplay. Solution did not mean an answer to a problem. It meant a liquid mixture. The song was a warning, not a command. Suicide is slow with liquor meant drinking yourself to death over a period of years, exactly as Bon Scott had done, and exactly as Ozzy was doing. It was a song about the misery of alcoholism. He explained that the shoot-shoot sounds in the fade-out were not commands to use a gun. They were his own vocal ad-libs shouting, "Get the glass, get the glass." The judge listened to the master tapes. He listened to the isolated vocal tracks. He found no evidence of subliminal commands. He found no evidence of a hemisync tone designed to control minds. He ruled in Ozzy's favor. He stated that the lyrics were protected speech and that a singer could not be held responsible for the tragic mental illness of a listener. He dismissed the case. Ozzy walked out of the courthouse a free man, but the victory was hollow. The headline, "Ozzy Sued for Suicide," was printed in every newspaper. The nuance of the verdict was lost. To a large segment of the American population, he was no longer just a musician. He was a monster who whispered death into the ears of teenagers. He won the case, but the label of child killer and Satanist stuck. The pressure of the trial, the lingering grief for Randy, and the relentless touring schedule pushed his alcohol consumption to lethal levels. By 1989, Ozzy Osbourne was a ghost. He was physically present, but the lights were out behind his eyes. He was taking a cocktail of tranquilizers to sleep and amphetamines to wake up, washing it all down with cases of beer. His tolerance was superhuman. He could consume amounts that would hospitalize a normal man and still function, albeit on a primitive, aggressive level. The climax of this era occurred in August 1989. The setting was the Moscow Music Peace Festival. It was intended to be a historic event, a rock concert promoting world peace and sobriety in the Soviet Union. The irony was palpable. While the organizers spoke of a drug-free future, Ozzy was backstage drinking the Russian promoters under the table. The flight back to England was a nightmare. The plane was stocked with alcohol. Ozzy didn't sleep, he drank. He stewed in his own rage. He felt persecuted by the press, controlled by his management, and haunted by his past. The alcohol stripped away the final layers of his inhibition. By the time the plane landed in the UK, John Osborne had left the building. Only the addiction remained. He arrived at his estate in Buckinghamshire in the middle of the night. It was raining. The house was quiet. His 3 children, Amy, Kelly, and Jack, were asleep in their beds. His wife, Sharon, was sitting in the bedroom reading a book. She looked up as the door opened. She saw her husband standing there. He was still wearing his clothes from the flight. He was soaked. But it was his face that terrified her. It was blank. There was no anger. There was no recognition. His eyes were black holes, dilated pupils swallowing the iris. He looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture, an obstacle to be removed. He didn't scream. He didn't yell about money or the band. He spoke with a calm, flat authority that was more terrifying than any rage. He said, "We've decided you have to go." The use of the plural "we" suggests the level of his fracture. He was listening to the voices in his head. He was operating on the orders of his psychosis. He lunged. It was not a clumsy, drunken stumble. It was a direct, purposeful attack. He knocked her back onto the bed. He climbed on top of her. He put his hands around her throat. He squeezed. The strength in his hands was mechanical. Sharon clawed at his face. She kicked. He didn't blink. He simply increased the pressure. She could feel her windpipe collapsing. The world began to go gray at the edges. She was dying. She was being murdered by the father of her children in her own bed. In her flailing, her hand struck the bedside table. She knocked over a lamp. Her fingers found the panic button that had been installed for security. She pressed it. The alarm shrieked through the house. The piercing noise cut through the fog of Ozzy's brain just enough to break his concentration. He loosened his grip. He stumbled back, confused by the sound. Sharon gasped for air, her throat bruised, her lungs burning. The police arrived within minutes. They burst into the room expecting a hostage situation or a shootout. What they found was pathetic. The Prince of Darkness was sitting quietly in the corner of the room, staring at the wall. He was calm. He was compliant. He didn't know why they were there. He didn't remember the attack. The adrenaline of the violence had burned itself out, leaving only the blackout. They handcuffed him. He allowed them to lead him out of his home past the rooms where his children slept. He woke up in a jail cell at the Amersham police station. The concrete floor was cold. The air smelled of disinfectant and stale vomit. He had a throbbing headache. He assumed he had been arrested for being drunk and disorderly, a routine occurrence in his life. He waited for his lawyer. He waited for Sharon to come and bail him out as she always did. A police officer came to the bars. Ozzy asked when he could go home. The officer looked at him with no amusement. He read the charge sheet. John Michael Osbourne was charged with the attempted murder of Sharon Osbourne. The words hit him like a physical blow. The reality of his situation crashed down. He hadn't just embarrassed himself. He hadn't just broken a hotel room. He had tried to kill the only person who had ever tried to save him. The horror was absolute. He sat on the bunk and wept. He realized that the drugs had finally taken his soul. He had become the monster the courts accused him of being. Sharon did not come to bail him out immediately. She let him sit there. She let him feel the weight of the bars. She was terrified, but she was also strategic. She knew that if she simply forgave him, he would kill her eventually. She had to break the cycle. She dropped the criminal charges because she refused to let her children's father go to prison for decades. But she replaced the judge's sentence with one of her own. She went to the jail. She sat across from him behind the glass. She told him that the marriage was over. She told him he would never see his children again, unless the condition was absolute. There were no negotiations. There were no promises to cut back. It was total abstinence or total loss. She gave him an ultimatum: rehab or divorce. Ozzy chose rehab. Chapter 5, Reinvention and Empire, 1990 to 2009. He emerged from rehab terrified but sober. The silence in his head was louder than the music. For 20 years, he had never walked into a recording studio without a chemical buffer. He did not know if he could sing, write, or perform without the liquid courage that had defined his existence. The industry was watching, waiting for him to fail, waiting for the inevitable relapse that would finish what the attempted murder charge had started. He was clean, but he was fragile. He channeled that fear into work. He sat down with guitarists and songwriters, forcing himself to focus through the withdrawal and the anxiety. The result was No More Tears, released in 1991. It was not the work of a washed-up has-been. It was a commercially potent, musically sharp, heavy metal record that defied the expectations of critics who had written his obituary. The track Mama, I'm Coming Home was a radio hit, a direct public apology to the wife he had almost killed. It softened his image. It showed a vulnerability that the leather and bats had obscured. The album went quadruple platinum. It seemed that Ozzy had pulled off the impossible again. He was back. But by the mid-90s, grunge had taken over. The musical landscape shifted violently overnight. The release of Nirvana's Nevermind rendered the theatrics of 1980s metal obsolete. The new generation of rock stars did not wear capes or bite heads off animals. They wore flannel shirts, stared at their shoes, and sang about apathy. They despised the excess and the showmanship that Ozzy represented. To the teenagers listening to Pearl Jam and Soundgarden, Ozzy Osbourne was not a god. He was a cartoon character. He was a relic from a time of hairspray and misogyny. He looked like a dinosaur. The ticket sales began to soften. The radio stations stopped playing his new tracks. Ozzy felt the cold wind of irrelevance. He panicked. In 1992, he announced his retirement. He called it the No More Tours Tour. He claimed he wanted to spend time with his family, citing a misdiagnosis of multiple sclerosis, which was actually the tremors from his drug abuse and genetic condition. He played his final shows. He gave away his stage clothes. He went home to Buckinghamshire to be a pensioner. Retirement was a disaster. Ozzy Osbourne was not built for leisure. He sat on his couch. He watched World War II documentaries until he memorized the narration. He annoyed his neighbors. He drove Sharon crazy. Without the adrenaline of the stage, without the routine of the road, the demons began to scratch at the door. He realized that silence was not peace. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled with vodka. He needed the noise. He needed the adulation. He begged Sharon to get him back out there, but the industry doors were closed. When Sharon approached the organizers of Lollapalooza, the premier alternative rock festival of the era, to book Ozzy, they laughed in her face. They told her that Ozzy was uncool. They told her that their audience didn't want to see a dusty old metal singer. They rejected him flat out. Sharon, refusing to accept his obsolescence, created Ozzfest in 1996. It was a gamble that defied the logic of the music business. If the gatekeepers wouldn't let Ozzy in, she would build a new gate. She organized a touring festival that centered entirely around her husband. But she was strategic. She didn't just book old bands, she booked the hottest new acts in metal: Pantera, Sepultura, Marilyn Manson, Slipknot. She created a bridge between the old guard and the new blood. The kids came to see the new bands, but they stayed to see the legend. It worked. Ozzfest became the highest-grossing touring festival in hard rock. It revitalized the entire genre. It transformed Ozzy from a washed-up singer into the godfather of metal. He wasn't competing with the new bands. He was presiding over them. He was the emperor of a traveling kingdom that generated millions of dollars every summer. While Ozzfest reestablished his dominance on the road, Sharon saw an opportunity to conquer a new medium. In 2002, MTV put cameras in their house. The concept was simple. Reality television was in its infancy. The network wanted to see the daily life of the Prince of Darkness. They expected orgies, bats, and satanic rituals. They expected a horror movie. What they got was a sitcom. The Osbournes became a cultural phenomenon. It was the highest-rated show in the network's history. The world tuned in to see Ozzy Osbourne, the man who was accused of corrupting the youth of America, struggling to put a trash bag in a bin. They saw him yelling at his dogs for urinating on the carpets. They saw him confused by a ringing telephone. They saw him arguing with his teenage children about curfews. The contrast was comedy gold. It shattered the mystique of the rock star, but it replaced it with something more lucrative: relatability. He became America's favorite dad. He was invited to the White House Correspondents' Dinner. He met the Queen. He was everywhere. But the cameras captured the cracks. The Ozzy Osbourne on the screen was not a sober man enjoying his twilight years. He was a man heavily medicated. He slurred his speech not just because of his accent, but because of the cocktail of prescription drugs he was ingesting daily. He shuffled when he walked. He shook. The audience laughed at the bumbling behavior, thinking it was just Ozzy being Ozzy. They didn't realize they were watching a man in the grip of a medical and chemical decline. The pressure of the show was crushing. The crew was in the house 24 hours a day. There was no privacy. There was no escape. The stress triggered the old mechanisms in Ozzy's brain. He couldn't drink openly because Sharon and the cameras were watching. So he drank in the shadows. He hid bottles of wine in the laundry room. He smoked marijuana in the bathroom. He took fistfuls of prescription pills to numb the anxiety of being constantly filmed. The sobriety he had fought so hard for after the attempted murder charge evaporated. He became a functional addict again, performing the role of the lovable eccentric while his chemistry spiraled out of control. The show also destroyed the anonymity of his children. Jack and Kelly were thrust into the global spotlight as teenagers. They had money, access, and no boundaries. Both of them developed serious drug and alcohol addictions during the filming of the show. The family was imploding on national television, and the world was laughing along, thinking it was just entertainment. However, the massive success of the reality show, combined with Ozzfest, made the Osbournes the undeniable mafia of metal. They held the keys to the kingdom. If a band wanted to break into the American market, they had to play Ozzfest. This gave Sharon and Ozzy immense power, and they wielded it with ruthless efficiency. They demanded loyalty. They demanded respect. Those who crossed them paid a heavy price. This power was displayed in 2005. Iron Maiden was on the tour. They were legends in their own right, a disciplined, professional British metal band that prided themselves on musical precision. Their singer, Bruce Dickinson, was the antithesis of Ozzy. Dickinson was a pilot, a fencer, and an articulate historian. He viewed Ozzy's shambolic, teleprompter-reliant performances as an embarrassment to the art form. Bruce Dickinson did not keep his opinions to himself. Night after night on Ozzy's own stage, Dickinson made snide comments. He mocked the reality show. He mocked the use of a teleprompter to remember lyrics. He told the audience that Iron Maiden didn't need a teleprompter because they were real musicians. He was biting the hand that fed him. Sharon Osbourne watched from the side of the stage, seething. She did not call lawyers. She did not cancel their contract. She planned a street-level retaliation. She rallied the roadies, the entourage, and other bands. She distributed ammunition. At the final show of the tour in San Bernardino, California, the trap was sprung. Iron Maiden took the stage. During their first song, the PA system cut out. It was not a technical glitch, it was sabotage. The power was cut on Sharon's orders. Dickinson tried to rally the crowd, then the assault began. A group of people in the front row, planted by the Osbourne camp, began to pelt the band. They threw eggs, they threw lighters, they threw ice. It was a coordinated barrage. Dickinson was hit. He was furious. He screamed at the attackers. He accused Ozzy of being a coward. Sharon marched onto the stage after their set, grabbed the microphone, and addressed the confused crowd of 40,000 people. She called Dickinson a prick. She admitted she cut the power. She admitted she ordered the egging. She told the crowd that while she loved Iron Maiden, she would not allow anyone to disrespect her husband in his own house. It was brutal. It was petty. But it sent a clear message to the entire industry. The Osbournes were not just a management team. They were a family business that operated on the laws of the street. But this corporate dominance led to internal conflicts that turned ugly. The protection of the Ozzy brand turned against old friends. For decades, the name Black Sabbath had been the property of Tony Iommi. He was the only member who had never left the band. He had kept the name alive through the lean years of the 1980s and 1990s, touring with various singers while Ozzy was building his solo career. But by 2009, the dynamic had shifted. Ozzy was now arguably bigger than the band that spawned him. He looked at the merchandising, the legacy, and the revenue, and he decided he wanted his share. In May 2009, Ozzy Osbourne filed a lawsuit against Tony Iommi in federal court in New York. He demanded 50% ownership of the Black Sabbath trademark. His legal argument was aggressive. He claimed that his signature vocals and his Prince of Darkness persona were the essential elements that gave the band its value. He argued that when the public thought of Black Sabbath, they thought of Ozzy Osbourne, not the guitar player. He accused Iommi of illegally seizing sole ownership of the name. He released a public statement that was a direct attack on his former friend. He said that Iommi was arrogant to think the band was solely his. He claimed that the other members had been marginalized. It was a shocking move. These were men who had grown up on the same bomb-scarred streets of Aston. They had changed the world together. Now they were fighting over logos and t-shirt money. The metal community was divided. Some saw Ozzy as a greedy megalomaniac, manipulated by Sharon to grab assets he had abandoned years ago. Others felt Iommi had profited unfairly from Ozzy's fame. The lawsuit dragged on, creating a toxic atmosphere that seemed to doom any chance of a final reunion. It stripped away the romance of the band and revealed the cold, hard business beneath. It was an ugly legal battle between two men from Aston, settled out of court, but it showed Ozzy's desperate need to own his legacy. However, the war for sobriety was never truly won. In 2013, during the recording of the Black Sabbath reunion album 13, the pressure triggered a collapse. Ozzy relapsed. When Sharon found out, she kicked him out. At 64 years old, Ozzy found himself sitting alone in a hotel room, just as he had been in 1979. The cycle had repeated. He clawed his way back, only to sabotage his life again in 2016. He was caught having an affair with a hairstylist. Sharon humiliated him publicly on television, but ultimately took him back. They realized they were two halves of the same dysfunctional organism. They were incapable of existing apart. Chapter 6. The Medical Miracle, 2010. In 2010, the scientific community came calling. A research company called Nome decided to map Ozzy's genome to understand how he was still alive. This was not a publicity stunt for a reality show. It was serious medical research. The scientists were baffled. They had looked at the actuarial tables. They had looked at the toxicology reports of his peers, and they realized that statistically, John Michael Osbourne should have died 40 years prior. They wanted to know if the answer lay in his DNA. They took samples of his blood. They ran them through supercomputers. The results were published and presented at a medical conference, confirming what fans had suspected for decades, but science had never quantified. The study revealed that Ozzy Osbourne is a genetic mutant. This is not a metaphor. It is a biological fact. The sequencing uncovered several specific anomalies in his genetic code that separated him from the average human being. The primary discovery concerned the ADH4 gene. In a standard human body, this gene is responsible for producing the enzymes that break down alcohol in the liver. When a normal person drinks to excess, the liver becomes overwhelmed, toxins build up, and the organ begins to fail, leading to cirrhosis. Ozzy has a rare mutation of this gene. His liver does not just process alcohol, it attacks it. It breaks down ethanol with brutal efficiency, allowing him to consume quantities of liquor that would be lethal to a normal man without suffering immediate organ failure. While his friends were passing out or dying of alcohol poisoning, Ozzy's body was metabolizing the poison and asking for more. However, the study also noted that while he could process booze, he was 6 times more likely to hallucinate on marijuana, explaining his lifelong preference for hard drugs over pot. The mutations extended beyond alcohol. The study found variants on the genes regulating dopamine and adrenaline. These are the chemicals that surge when a person takes stimulants like cocaine or amphetamines. Usually, a massive spike in these chemicals causes the heart to beat erratically, leading to cardiac arrest. This is the mechanism that killed John Bonham and many others in the rock scene. Ozzy's genes allowed his receptors to handle these massive chemical surges without short-circuiting his cardiovascular system. He was biologically engineered to survive the lifestyle that killed everyone else. Furthermore, the analysis detected a significant amount of Neanderthal DNA. He possesses 3 times the amount of Neanderthal lineage as the average European. This ancient genetic coding is associated with extreme physical resilience and a robust immune system. It provided him with a constitution designed for survival in harsh, primitive environments, which ironically proved useful in the toxic environment of the heavy metal tour bus. The study also solved a long-standing mystery regarding his physical tremors. For years, doctors assumed the shaking in his hands was a symptom of drug withdrawal or brain damage from alcohol. The genetic mapping proved otherwise. The shakes and tremors he had suffered for decades were also explained not just by drugs, but by a mutation on the TTN gene affecting nerve signaling. He was shaking because his wiring was different. However, biology has limits. Genes could protect his organs, but not his bones. In 2019, Ozzy fell in his bathroom at night. In 2018, a simple manicure led to a staph infection that swelled his thumb to the size of a light bulb. Doctors told him he was lucky to be alive, but the hits kept coming. It was a mundane accident. There was no plane crash, no overdose, no bat. He simply got up in the dark to use the toilet, lost his footing, and fell forward. The impact was devastating. Years earlier, in 2003, he had been in a near-fatal ATV accident that required metal rods to be inserted into his body to stabilize his skeleton. The fall in the bathroom dislodged these metal rods. The force of the impact drove the steel hardware into his spinal column. He lay on the floor in agony, convinced he was paralyzed. The surgery was catastrophic. It was not a simple repair. The surgeons had to navigate through scar tissue and aged bone. It involved cutting through the muscles of his neck to realign the spine. The procedure took hours. When he woke up, the pain had not subsided, it had evolved. The trauma to the spinal cord left him with severe nerve damage. This was not the dull ache of a broken bone. It was neuropathic pain, a constant firing signal from his damaged nerves to his brain. It was a sensation he described as ice water flowing through his veins. His arms were numb, his legs were cold. The man who had endured tattoos on his knuckles, with a sewing needle and rabies shots in his stomach, found himself weeping from a pain that no medication could fully touch. During this period, he went public with his diagnosis of PRKN2, a form of Parkinson's disease. This was a specific genetic variant of the neurodegenerative disorder. It was distinct from the standard Parkinson's that causes uncontrollable shaking. Instead, PRKN2 attacked his mobility and his fluidity. It wasn't a death sentence, but it affected his movement, giving him a stiffness known as the Parkinson's mask. His facial muscles became rigid. His expression became fixed. To the outside world, he looked vacant or stoned, but inside, his mind was sharp, trapped behind a face that refused to obey his commands. He developed a shuffle. His center of gravity shifted. Walking became a conscious, labored effort. He spent a year in bed, depressed, watching the world move on. The psychological toll was heavier than the physical one. For 50 years, Ozzy Osbourne had been a shark. He had to keep moving to survive. Now he was anchored to a mattress. The tabloids began to circle. The press wrote his obituaries. They speculated that he was on his deathbed, that the fall had been the final nail in the coffin. But the stubbornness of the slaughterhouse worker remained. He refused to rot. He forced himself into physical therapy. It was humiliating work, learning to stand on one leg, learning to walk down a hallway, but he did it. He hated the weakness, joking to reporters, "I feel like a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest." He channeled his frustration into the only outlet he had left. He recorded Ordinary Man and Patient Number 9 sitting in a chair. He couldn't stand in the vocal booth. He couldn't run around. He sat and sang. The lyrics were stark. He sang about the cemetery waiting for him. He sang about his friends who had gone ahead. He sang about his own decay. Yet the voice, that piercing, high-pitched wail that had defined metal, remained miraculously intact. The body was failing, but the instrument was pristine. His collaboration with Post Malone on the track Take What You Want introduced his voice to a generation that thought Black Sabbath was a clothing brand, proving his relevance remained intact. Current medical reality for Ozzy is a daily negotiation with pain. Every step is a calculation. He walks with a cane. He needs help getting out of cars. He has a team of nurses and therapists who stretch his limbs and manage his medication. But he is still Ozzy. He still swears at the television. He still cracks jokes about his own funeral. He still dreams of one last show. He is not asking for a residency in Las Vegas. He is not asking for a holographic tour. He wants to stand on a stage, grip the microphone stand, and hear the roar of a crowd one more time. He wants to finish the job on his own terms. He managed to achieve a glimpse of this in 2022. He stood on a platform at the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham, his hometown. Supported by a custom metal rig to hold his hips, he sang Paranoid one last time to the city that made him. Following this closure, he and Sharon made the decision to sell their Los Angeles mansion and move back to England permanently. They wanted to escape the American taxes and gun violence, but mostly they wanted to be buried in the soil that made them. He is the cockroach of rock and roll. The world tried to stomp on him, poison him, and burn him, but he crawled out of the wreckage every time. The man who wanted to die in a hotel room in 1979 is the one who lived to tell the tale.